Hello students, my name is Purushottam Vishnu Bhandare. I am from Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. Today we will be discussing about Todaro's model of rural-urban migration. In this module, we will be learning Todaro's model of rural-urban migration. We will look at the position of Todaro's model in the literature of development economics, then key hypotheses of the model, then functional model and limitations of the model. John R. Harris and Michael P. Todaro presented a seminal paper which is two-sector model published in American Economic Association in 1970. The model is a pioneering study in the field of encompassing rural-urban migration. The classical theory is used in development economics and is an economic illustration of migrants' decision on expected income differentials between rural, which is agriculture, and urban, which is manufacturing areas. The model of rural-urban migration is typically studied in the context of employment, unemployment situation in developing countries. In the model, the purpose is to explain the critical urban employment problem in developing countries. The key hypotheses of Harris and Todaro are the migrants react mainly to economic incentives, earning differentials, and the probability of getting a job at a destination have to influence their migration decision. In other words, this theory put forward that rural-urban migration will occur when the urban expected wage exceed the rural obtained wage. Now we will look at the literature for Todaro model in development economics. It has long been realized that in order for an economy to develop or grow, a large amount of labor has to be transferred from the traditional or backward agricultural sector in rural areas where the productivity of labor is zero, low or negligible or even negative, to the modern manufacturing sector where the productivity of labor is high and rising due to capital accumulation in that sector. It should not be surprising, therefore, in the literature of development economics, dualistic models gained popularity over the single commodity or single sector theories in 1950s. A typical dualistic model in development economics contains two sectors, a traditional or agricultural sector in the rural area and a modern or manufacturing sector in the urban area. The most familiar single sector model is the growth theory of Harrod 1939 and Domer 1946. The most representative and influential dualistic framework is that of Lewis in 1954. The ideas of surplus labor, subsistence wages, and turning points in the development of a dualistic economy in Lewis 1954 were later rigorously and diagrammatically formalized by Ranis and Fay in 1961. Ranis and Fay also showed how agricultural surplus could lead to the growth of industries. The production relation of a dual economy, according to Jorgensen's in 1961, was characterized by asymmetry. More precisely, he assumed that output in the agricultural sector was a function of land and labor alone. There is no capital accumulation in this sector and was characterized by diminishing return to scale. On the other hand, the output and the urban sector depending on the capital and labor alone, where no land was required, and the production function displayed constant return to scale. Since the amount of land and capital in the economy was assumed fixed, the only problem was to allocate labor between the two sectors. The common features of the dualistic theories discussed so far and some other models that nature are: first one is, there is no unemployment in the modern sector. The second is, the sectoral wage differential is assumed fixed or proportional to the wage level in the urban sector. These models were later labeled as orthodox by Cordon and Findlay in 1971. The unorthodox thinking was first and independently introduced by several economists. Notably, among whom were Michael Todaro 1969 and John Harris and Todaro 1970. The essence of the new thinking, which has to be reminiscent of the new Keynesian revolution, is that there can be a equilibrium with an existence of chronic large amount of urban unemployment. By the end of 1960s, the world had seen the rapid growth of urban areas in the developing countries, from Dar es Salaam to Karachi to Caracas, from land surplus to labor surplus to capital surplus countries. One hears of the ever increasing flow of rural migrants into urban area and of the inability of the urban economy to provide permanent jobs for even majority of these workers. Todaro 1969. For instance, between 1950 and 1960, urban areas in Africa grew by 69%, in Latin America it by 67%, and in Asia it grew by 51%, while rural areas grew by only 20% over the same period, which is studied by the Fields 1975. The most important factor that causes urban population explosion has been the migration of labor from the rural areas into the cities throughout the less developed world. Population growth also contributes to this phenomena, but in a much less time scale, since it rarely exceeds 3%. In the context of dualistic model, the rural sector is discharging labor too and rapidly. The urban sector is hiring labor too slow because it is too highly capital intensive. The Lewis found it in 1965. As a result, the urban manifestation of the employment problem becomes the most visible feature of poverty and underdevelopment of the third world countries. Lubell 1988. It has been pointed out by many that economic considerations or urban-rural wage differentials play an important role in determining the extent of labor migration. The higher than competitive urban wage is due to a combination of trade union pressure, nationalistic government pressure on foreign enterprises, and the new social conscience of big entrepreneurs. Lewis 1965. Citing the case of increasing gap between urban and agricultural earnings in Puerto Rico, Reynolds 1965 argues that minimum urban wage are politically determined, that is, through the legislation. Herbanger 1971 distinguishes urban wages into the protected sector wages and unprotected urban wages. The former is the above the market clearing level and is believed to be held high by minimum wage laws, by collective bargaining agreements, or by the policy of the hiring company itself. In parts of China, minimum wage have been set up since 1988 by local governments, mainly to prevent joint ventures from exploiting their local employees. This has been referred from China Reform Journal 1994. It was the observation of a curious economic phenomenon in tropical Africa that led to the pioneering work of Harris and Todaro 1970. The phenomenon was the continual and accelerating urban-rural migration despite the existence of positive marginal products in agriculture. Todaro's main contribution is the introduction of the probability of employment as an element in the decision-making process of a potential migrant. He proposed what he called a more realistic picture of a labor migration in less developed countries, that is, a two-stage process. The first stage is where the rural migrant enters the urban area and settles down in the so-called traditional urban sector, or more popularly the informal sector, for a certain period of time. The second stage is reached when the migrant finds a more permanent job in the modern sector. It is to be noted that Todaro and later on some others did not consider the informal urban sector explicitly. Its employees, usually underemployed, not being distinguished from those who are not employed at all. They make no income on their own and were supposed to live out of the support of their relatives in their origins or in the cities. For a vivid description of informal sector, we can see at Lewis 1954 work. The probability of landing a job, according to Todaro, depends on the number of newly created jobs in the modern sector, the size of the population of the urban unemployment, and the length of a time migrant has been in the urban area. At any time, jobs were allocated as if by a lottery. Understandably, the longer one has been in the urban area, the more likely he will find a job in the manufacturing sector. The criterion used in making the decision to migrate or not to migrate is the expected relative present real values and of the two choices. An important extension in this direction was done by Harris and Todaro 1970, where they formulated the idea that the rural wage is equated to the expected urban wage into now the famous Harris-Todaro equation, which can be mathematically represented as WA is equal to beta WM, where WA is the flexible wage in the agricultural sector, which is equated to the value of the marginal product in that sector. Beta is considered as the probability of employment depending on the number of newly created jobs, the size of the population of the urban unemployed, and WM is the wage in the manufacturing sector and is assumed to be fixed institutionally, either because union activities or a friendly government towards to the workers in the modern sector above the competitive level. Many empirical results showed that real wages were consistently higher in unionized sectors. A Matcher in 1989 found that, unlike in the orthodox models, the urban wage, not the sectoral wage differential, is assumed to be fixed. A very effective illustration of what we will refer as a Harris-Todaro is given by Cordon and Findley in 1975. Their geometric representation of the model was straightforward and elucidating. The major contribution, however, is the introduction of intersectoral capital mobility into the original Harris-Todaro model. They also treated the economy as small as open and enabling the prices of the products from both sectors to be fixed. It is important to note that Harris-Todaro model, as was in Harris and Todaro 1970 or Cordon and Findley 1975, does not assume asymmetry about the production technologies. The policy implications of the Harris-Todaro model are understandably different from those of the orthodox models. When there is a wage differential with no urban unemployment, a wage subsidy in the manufacturing sector is clearly first best policy, which restores the output of the modern sector to its level under no labor market distortion. With urban unemployment, a wage subsidy alone may not be optimal. Harris and Todaro 1970 suggested a wage subsidy to the manufacturing sector. Combined with a restriction on migration, a uniform wage subsidy was proposed by Bhagwati and Srinivasan in 1974 and Cordon in 1974. But, as pointed out by Cordon and Findlay in 1975, who also found wage subsidies were superior to other methods, the financing problem cannot be ignored. While some developing countries have relied on import substitution policies, Balasa 1988, some East Asian least developed countries such as South Korea, Taiwan have adopted outward-looking strategies. They have promoted exports by subsidizing production of exportable goods extensively, while limiting imports of finalized manufactures. Despite the theory that a tariff hurts a small open economy, these countries have experienced phenomenal economic growth. On the whole, these strategies seem to have been quite successful. During 1963 to 73 period, the growth rates of strongly outward oriented developing countries were 7.4%, whereas those of strongly inward oriented developing countries recorded an average growth rate of about 1.7%. This we can draw from World Bank 1987 report. The Harris-Todaro model was an academic investigation through light on the events of following tripartite agreement in Kenya. The newly independent Kenya in the 1960s was facing a serious situation of unemployment in major urban cities that was continuously at rise. To cope the situation of unemployment, tripartite agreement was signed between government public sector and the private sector. The agreement made to increase employment in industrial jobs in exchange for unions agreeing to hold wages at their current levels. The larger number of employment was expected to reduce unemployment, but it appeared that urban unemployment has increased following the government agreement. Harris and Todaro subsequently formulated a model to explain rural-urban economic preferences to migrate. The distinctive concept in the model is the rate of migration flow from rural, which is agricultural areas, to urban, which is industrial areas, is determined by the difference between expected urban wages and rural wages. The rural-urban two-sector model currently holds the following features. First one is real wages, which are adjusted for cost of living differences, were higher in urban formal sector than the rural traditional sector jobs. Second one, to be hired for a formal sector job, it was necessary to be physically present in the urban areas where the formal sector jobs are located. Third, consequently, from the first two features, more workers search for formal sector jobs than actually hired. Employers hire some of the T searchers, but not all of them, to maintain quality between the expected wage associated with the searching for an urban job and the expected wage associated with taking up a lower paying rural job. The equilibrium arising in such settling world would be characterized by urban unemployment Last one is any temporary difference in the expected wages between one sector and another would be eroded as workers migrate from the low expected wage labor market to the high expected wage one. Let us look at the functional model. There are two regions, rural, which is agricultural, and urban, which is industrial. The crucial assumption of the Harrison-Todaro model is that workers base their migration decision on their expected incomes at urban, which is industrial areas. Because the basic model is static, the expected income is just the weighted average of the urban wage and the employment benefit, the weights being the probabilities to find and not to find an urban job. The model assumed that the rate of rural urban, which is M is equal to capital M upon LR, is a function of 1. The probability that an urban labor can successfully find a modern sector job, which can be expressed as a positive function of the current urban employment rate, which is EU upon LU, or LU minus EU upon LU, a negative function of urban unemployment rate. Second, the urban-rural real income differential expressed as YU upon YR is equal to W, which is W greater than 1. Besides, migration will also be related to other factors which are considered as Z, such as distance, personal conduct, and urban amenities, where M is equal to rate of migration from rural to urban areas. Capital M is actual volume of rural urban migration. LR is rural labor force. EU is level of urban employment. LU is urban labor force. YU is urban real income. YR is rural real income. W is ratio between rural urban real income. Therefore, the basic rural migration model is expressed as rural minus urban migration. M is equal to function of current urban employment rate, urban rural real income differential, and personal factors. Thus, rural urban migration rate M is equal to function of EU upon LU, W, and Z, which equation becomes function of EU upon LU holding W and Z constants is equal to function of the ratio between the level of employment and urban labor force, where function of EU upon LU is greater than 0, function of W is greater than 0, and function of Z may have positive or negative values. Here functions are time derivative of 3 elements. That is, migration rate is a function of the ratio between the level of urban employment and urban labor force, or the probability to find a job in an urban industrial sector. Besides, urban labor force growth can be expressed as IU upon LU is equal to small r plus LR upon LU of M is equal to R plus L R bar upon L U bar, function of EU upon LU, which is equation second, where R stands for natural growth rate of rural urban labor force. IU stands for time derivatives of LU, which is urban labor force. Time derivative of urban labor force growth rate is a function of urban labor force growth rate and the probability of finding a job in a modern urban sector. Model then tried to compare the leave path of the equation which are discussed previously with the growth rate of urban employment and discussed rural urban migration and urban migration. The different assumptions of population and employment growth rates. Now we will discuss the Harris-Todaro's model. Harris-Todaro's rural-urban two-sector migration model fundamental contribution was to build a model that fit the stylized facts of the labor market. On the lines of the theory, developing countries adopted a program on integrated rural development which encouraged an increase in the rural traditional sector wage. This theory proves that the higher is the unemployment rate, the lower is the probability of new migrants from a new countryside actively seeking formal sector employment are unable to find it. The significant findings of the theory is: first, if the expected urban wage equals rural income, there is no incentive to migrate. And secondly, if the expected urban wage is greater than rural income, there is a great incentive to move from rural to urban area. Thirdly, if the expected urban wage is less than rural income, there would be incentive to move in other direction. Fourthly, the expected urban wage depends on what type of job migrant is engaged to. Therefore, the Harris-Todaro model helps policymakers to avoid two mistakes. First one is to assume the development efforts should necessarily be channeled to the sectoral where the poor are. And the second one is to assume that efforts should necessarily be focused on getting the poor out of the sectors in which they are now. Of course, the Harris-Todaro model has certain limitations. Some of the assumptions of Harris-Todaro model were just to be too restrictive. The model too assumes potential migrants are risk neutral, where the poor migrants will likely be at risk averse. As in, they are indifferent between a certain expected rural income and uncertain expected urban income of the same magnitude. The assumption there exists a perfect competition in rural agricultural sector is neither realistic. Thank you.